Okay, so Dr. Amber Gray, I have had the privilege of getting to learn under her for some of my time here in grad school as I'm studying dance movement therapy. And she is a dance movement therapist among many other things. One thing I pulled from her bio that I think beautifully describes her is a licensed human rights psychotherapist. So that encompasses so much of the work that I've gotten to hear from being one of her students. And so I am really looking forward to interviewing her today and getting some of her expertise on the field. So, Amber, I would love if you would just start off with a little introduction, who you are and what you do as a dance movement therapist.
Okay. I'm giggling because I think I was like, you already did that. And I think I'll start with a dance movement therapist and a human rights psychotherapist. Where that really comes from is since I was in school, because it was my practicum and then my internship has been working with survivors of political violence, war, torture, um, genocide, different trafficking. And so that has been a thread through all of my work as a dance movement therapist. A lot of clinical work, also teaching, education, supervision, things like that, also running programs, setting programs up. And even though that's not specifically dance movement therapy, I bring that, I would say I bring the holistic physiological intelligence of dance movement therapy to all of that work. And yeah, I mean, I think that's, and a lot of disaster work as well, humanitarian, working in humanitarian emergencies, disaster work, things like that. So
Yes, and that's something we'll really hone in on. I think that holistic piece, that holistic dance movement therapy piece. But for the audience that maybe doesn't even know what dance movement therapy is, could you give a brief overview of even what the field is?
sure. I often describe dance therapy simplistically as the connection or the marriage between dance and psychology, or mental. I like psychology because it's a whole field of study and research. And I think what's powerful about dance movement therapy is it brings together the creativity, the expressive nature of dance, the power of movement as um, a nonverbal form of communication that everyone has some relationship to. I'm not going to say they have the same relationship to, because culture will vary and influence how we express through movement. And certainly what movement means, that can never be assumed. And then there's also the physiological. When we're working with movement, we're working with the neurological underpinnings of, I always say, what we think, feel, behave, act, all of that. So it really brings the power of dance and movement together with psychology. And a lot of it is connected to developmental psychology, which is a constantly evolving and changing field. And I think probably more some of the neuropsychology that's coming out. So yeah, and I also describe it as at the crossroads of somatic psychology and creative arts psychotherapies, because we are a creative art. Dance is an expressive, creative um, form of artistry, and it's also very body based. So we're working with the whole human body.
Yes, that's something I love about this field is getting that holistic picture of the mind body connection and doing the trauma work through that perspective. So one thing you mentioned was the neurological underpinnings, and that brings me to a point that I'm particularly interested in your work, which is this unique side of your dance movement therapy practice incorporating polyvagal theory. So could you explain a little bit about polyvagal theory and then how that shows up in your work?
Sure. Well, and polyvagal theory is Dr. Stephen Porges' work. So I actually what I like to say is I think I have a deep intuitive understanding of it, but that's not my work. So, my work is polyvagal-informed, somatic and dance movement therapy. And what I'll say about it is what really happened, I think it was the first time I heard Steve speak at a conference. I think it was 2099 or 2000. And he was talking about his work with autism. And I was working with survivors of torture. And he was talking about face-to-face contact. And he was talking about I'm going to say healing. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what happens when somebody's perpetrated, violated in relationship? And I asked a question about that. And when Steve asked me to contextualize the question, he said, let's talk during the break. That's really interesting. So what that started was a lifelong friendship and mentoring that I'm extremely 20, I should say life. Isn't that interesting that I said lifelong? 24 years. I'm a lot older than that, but it feels like in terms of my dance movement therapy life, um, it's happened at the same time. So as I was a blossoming dance movement therapist, this life of dance movement therapy, immersion in polyvagal theory through mentoring, friendship, a lot of idea sharing. I think if I were to try to describe polyvagal theory, I don't know if I would do that as well, but polyvagal theory, from my perspective, was a theory. It is the theory that has revolutionized the way we understand the human nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and how we are wired. Or I think I'd say, I think there's so many levels where human beings are wired or born to be in relationship. I think relationship is the heart of humanity. And what polyvagal theory does is it offers a scientific explanation and ongoing scientific inquiry into why that is at the level of biology and physiology and our nervous system. We're obviously much more than that. I believe in spirit. We're our own physicality, our emotions, our thoughts, all of that arises from our physiology, our physicality, and then there's spirit. And I think one of the things that's really helpful with any theory, but especially polyvagal theory, is it gives us access to information that can actually be extremely universalizing and empowering in terms of understanding what happens in our lives, our bodies, ourselves when we experience. It could be exposure to something that becomes trauma. It can also be major life illness. It can be a condition like autism, things that shift the way we relate to the world in ways that may not be the usual way to relate to the world. I want to steer away from the word normal. Anyway, so I think what I've witnessed is that his research into the vagus nerve, which is at the core of polyvagal theory, the wandering nerve, I call it the nomadic nerve and the ancestral nerve are my nicknames for it. Its influence, it both carries a legacy of how evolution shows up for us now in terms of maintaining survival or being able to survive challenging life experiences, but also it has deep study into the polyvagal theory, for me, offers a lot of insight into our humanity and our future directions as we consider a world in which we might, in which a world that might. There's a book. I was just thinking there's a book that's called like The World That We, what's that book I'm thinking of? But in creating a world that we might all be able to live in and thrive in. And by all, I mean everybody, because by definition, polyvagal theory integrates species evolution. So we're all included, all of us, like nobody gets left out of this. I want to say a little bit about the universalizing because epigenetics, has shifted. Polyvagal theory, when I first started understanding it, I was very much seeing it in terms of person to person. And there are many people whose lives include, strong ancestral resources as well as strong ancestral oppression and, legacies, long-term legacies. And so we're learning a lot about how I think we might be, through history, through lineage, through legacy, our nervous systems might be conditioned in ways that our behavior might be other than it would have been if we didn't have these long ancestral legacies of oppression or familial I feel like I'm hoping that I'm not getting like too big with my thinking or with my explanation, but um, still, I think at the basis, human physiology and biology is an even starting point. It's something that where there is the possibility of more equality. I'm hoping that that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that really draws me to this
Yeah.
perspective in dance movement therapy as well, is that it's not based in the study of one culture
Yeah.
or one population, and so it really can be used with with a wide range with everybody, because it really gets down to the core of how are we fundamentally designed to thrive in that in really being able to live in that place of social engagement through activating the proper parts of the nervous system.
Yeah.
So that's something that has really drawn me to this work and leads me to believe that I will continue on similarly to you in my own practice in that way. So continuing on with the polyvagal theory, one thing that I pulled just from the research that I love that you've done is you talk about this idea of state shifting out of fear-based mobilization and immobilization. So how have you seen that shown up in your dance movement therapy work? Like how is movement practically used in your practice to help people with that state shifting?
Well, I would say that that actually was probably already happening, and it's both bringing dance movement therapy into polyvagal theory and polyvagal theory into dance movement therapy. So there was reciprocity there, right? It's a reciprocal exchange, and it relates to what I said about empowering. And I think to me that's the aspect of this work that's more recognizing that many people do not have the opportunity to express their birthright of living in a safe enough environment, and therefore their nervous system will be affected in different ways, historically, personally, ancestrally, than those of us who do live in safe enough environments. Um, but oh, I just lost my train of thought because I wanted to connect that to state shifting. That I want to connect that to empowering. One of the things that I recognize is that when people understood that, my clients, because I use this educationally in my work, and I would explain things about what happens to the nervous system in the moment of exposure to danger, which creates fear, and life threat, which creates terror. Um, my clients and my students, and this is all over the world. The first time was 2003 in Aceh, Indonesia. People, there was such a sense of empowerment to understand that what their body was actually doing in those moments was in service of survival and self-preservation, in service of their ongoing living and being on the planet. And so what we're really talking about are states. And so I think part of what happens with trauma, I'm using that word very broadly. I mean, I won't take, the word can be both underappreciated and overused, but there's a sense of isolation that always occurs. There's always, and this is, I've worked primarily with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think with many clinical diagnoses or clinical conditions or clinical situations, but that sense of isolation in under helping my clients understand that that what feels isolating, the imprint that's left from those moments of exposure and the way that affects behavior. I never want to leave my room. I don't trust anybody anymore. I don't want to go to the grocery store. When people start talking to me or walking to me too fast, I freak out, whatever it is. The things that tend to be isolating. And I'm going to use the term crazy making, even though I'm not crazy about that, are reflections of biological, physiological state shifts that get expressed as emotion and therefore as behavior. And so as I was working more and more into, psychoeducating my clients, which is an important part of the early phase of trauma treatment, um, I had to find language to describe what was happening. And very literally, one of the questions actually that my mentor Stephen asked me, because he knows that I spend a lot of time in Haiti, which is my spiritual home, and that I also study a lot of medicine practices. including my own, having Native American ancestry through my own lineage. We were talking one time, we were actually in Norway, and we were talking about some of the things I observed in healing ceremonies and the connection. And that was one of the reasons I chose dance movement therapy, somewhat naively back then, but recognizing dance, it being so core to so many ceremonial practices. And he asked me to reflect on what was it that what was it that really happened in ceremony. And the word, it's not an original word, but state shifting. And I said, that's what we're talking about. You're talking about, I said, your research is talking about state shifting. The fact that we, recruit the more primitive or evolutionarily older parts of our nervous system in order to survive, not necessarily consciously, but that as part of our physiological being, that our body does that when we're faced with danger or life threat. And in many ancient ceremonial practices, and then I realized in dance movement therapy, because we're moving and breathing and directly recruiting our own physiology. I mean, you have to, if you get up and move, you start to breathe faster, or if you do a more meditative contemplative movement piece, or if you get moved towards stillness or do something with breath, you're going to slow down. I was like, it's all state shifting. That's what we're doing. We're shifting states. And it's a hierarchy of physiological states, emotional and psychological states, behavioral states, all of that. And so the term is really drawn from both my spiritual practice and how I would polyvagalize dance movement therapy, and why I think dance movement therapy is so particularly powerful, because it's going to naturally promote state shifting by virtue of the fact that we're moving and breathing.
Yes, which I love about this field. It's very much under the idea that the mind, body, and spirit are all connected. And so bringing in these other fields of research like polyvagal theory, it just helps maybe explain on a more scientific level what we already know to be true fundamentally in our practice as dance movement therapists.
Yeah.
Yeah, so speaking more to that, you've brought in some of the heart rate, the breath. I would love to hear more about the working with biological rhythms and just how you see that show up in your work, how you've seen that impact people. I know another piece of that also is music, how a lot of dance movement therapists really promote the use of music as an intervention and why that might be.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because the biorhythms or core rhythmicity is very much about state shifting. So I think, and I'm not sure that I totally answered, because you asked how it shows up with clients, state shifting. I'll just say that one of the things that in service of the empowerment, that I think bringing polyvagal theory into dance movement therapy, which is called polyvagal-informed dance movement therapy, it's a mouthful. When my clients have recognized that the creepy crawlies coming up their back and the shift towards a shutdown, when they start to recognize the first moments, and it's hard with immobilization shutdown, or they recognize their heart rate going up, whether it's going up or just a sinking, whatever the physiological cues and the emotional cues are, that's really empowering, because that's when they can say, okay. And when I do, and as I have developed a bunch of practices that can be very simple 5-second streamlined little structured practices, or inviting people through much more fluid and spontaneous movement. When people start to remember what helps them maybe get a little more energy, right? That's a state shift. What they're really doing is maybe raising their heartbeat a little, or calm down a little bit. Maybe it's taking a few breaths. So when clients can learn to self-regulate through self-state shifting, that's that empowerment. And what we're really talking about are the biorhythms. So respiration, heart rate, vascular feedback. And I can't remember, it's 60 to 80 beats per minute for the heart. I think one breath every 3 to 5 seconds. I don't remember vascular feedback off the top of my head. I feel like it's every few seconds. And that's related to um, blood pressure. But years ago, I mean, one of my favorite articles is from the 80s by Cynthia Barrell. She's one of our dance therapy, longtime dance therapists who did I think she was doing an analysis of other research, and research in the 60s had shown that that external tempi, that if you change, what you're listening to, what music you're listening to, it'll affect you internally, right? If you put on Enya, you might slow your breath. If you put on Metallica, you might get your heart rate might go up. I mean, whatever, right? If you put on roots music and you start to dance, get into a more lyrical state, depending upon what state you begin in, right? You're either going to slow, or heart rate goes up, heart rate goes down, breathing goes up, breathing goes down. That's what promotes state shifts. So what we listen to externally directly influences our internal rhythms, literally heart, respiration, vascular feedback, and I'm sure cranial sacral, the tides, so many other rhythms in the body, lymphatic fluid, all of that. And so when our internal rhythm changes, our state shifts, we feel differently. So music is a really powerful accompaniment to our work. I mean, I often work without music, but working with music, I think, can really bring in an extra, especially when clients can choose music they love. And especially because I work with so many different cultures, I stopped. I mean, if they really have no idea what they want to listen to, I might choose music based on, what I'm observing in my client and what I think might be helpful. But I love to invite people to bring their own music, because we relate. Music is one of the most powerful expressions of our culture. And culture is what dresses up our physiology. It's what determines and informs how we express what we're feeling inside. So
Yeah, so I love that that whole idea of music as that external regulator. I actually have pulled from that article you talked about, the Barrel article, for my research
yeah.
as well. And so thinking about external regulators, music is one, and then another that came to mind was also even just the idea of the dyadic relationship, and how you as the therapist can also serve as another regulating force.
Yeah.
For state shifting, all of that, I think that really gets into maybe some of the attachment pieces that you see in dance movement therapy, or in the counseling literature as a whole. So how do you see that show up as you're using yourself as part of that, uh, the tool to help your client's state shift?
Well, and there's an article that Steve Porges wrote with Sherry Geller that's really good. And I don't, and I wish I had grabbed it on therapeutic presence. I don't remember the entire title. And I think that article is a must read for that. But, and I remember going back way back when the field, quantum physics and all those fields came out. And that's not my area of expertise, but I would just remember reading about things like the butterfly effect, and how, experiments done with plants where people would come in the room and they were sad or happy, and the plants would actually respond, lift up, like literally open when somebody's happy and kind of close when they're sad. And so, we know that there's a communication that happens that's not about, hey, how are you? I'm fine. That there's this nonverbal, we could use the word energetic exchange, and that previously dismissed as somewhat, woo woo, to use a non-scientific term. We now know that we actually do emit energy, and that there are, biomagnetic waves, and that nervous systems talk to nervous systems, and heart fields talk to heart fields, and brains talk to brains. And by talk, I don't mean, but that there's this stream of communication, this energetic connection. And so, who we are as who we are as a human is who we are as a therapist. And so one of the things I've discovered is the most important thing we have to do is to be authentic with ourselves. Like if I'm having a crap day, it's not about saying, okay, I'm going to do the neutral poker face. That's out the door now. We know that that doesn't necessarily communicate safety. Like our clients, an essential part of their perception of safety is their neuroception of safety, which is subcortical. Perception is conscious, neuroception is not. Their nervous system is scanning for danger, seeking safety. We are part of that in the space. And so how we show up. And so I always say there's no way to co-regulate if we don't self-regulate. We learn to self-regulate through co-regulation. Some of us may have some work to do on that depending upon how we were co-regulated, but it begins with our ability to self-regulate. And to me, it looks like self-authenticity, like knowing I'm having a tired day. I just had a phone call that made me really angry, and dang, I have a client in 5 minutes. And so it's not about, I think if we stuff it or hide it or go neutral, that's still there. So, in this space, this sort of space where our clients are neurocepting and also perceiving us, I think what's been helpful for me is to be real about what my states are and to do whatever I need to do in that session to regulate myself. And regulate means to it's not like I go around saying, oh, I have to self-regulate, but I feel a little tight inside. I just had an icky phone call. I'm grumpy. I don't really want to be here doing this work. I'm just being honest. This can happen, right? And so I might have to sit in a different chair. I might have to sit in the chair that naturally elevates my sits bones, that makes it easier for my spine to rise up, right? That puts my sacrum in that nice sacral neutral that promotes vagal tone. I might have to constantly bring awareness back to my own breathing in the first 10 minutes or maybe the whole session. Maybe I'm still a little, and I've had clients arrive when I'm amped up. And so I might just be like, okay, I do something called regulation breath, where I might gently press my sternum on every exhale and just kind of get my breath in that groove of more regulated breathing. That'll regulate the nervous system. I take care of myself. I take care of myself before I overextend taking care of my client. That's not really taking care of a client, is to overextend. Taking care of a client is taking care of ourselves, because that way our presence communicates, this is a safe enough internal experience. They're benefiting from our safe enough internal experience by however we're expressing that externally in the space that we're sharing with them.
Absolutely. If we're not in an ability to be in that social engagement system, how can a client connect with that?
Yeah.
If we're helping them state shift back to a place where they can safely engage, we better be a safe landing place for that emotion, or else we're disrupting the connection again that we're trying to rebuild in their nervous system.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So also another thing that you even brought up there was the idea of even sitting up, activating the vagus nerve, all of that. And I know something that I've gotten to hear you talk about even in classes was the idea of anatomically informed interventions, and how you've seen some of those really help people. I'm even thinking specifically working in like the different war trauma, all of that, natural disasters. So, but it might also be in other populations. How do you use this anatomically informed interventions to work with people?
Well, I was a massage therapist before I was a dance movement therapist. Before that, I was a public health person doing a lot of humanitarian work. So, but one of the things I love about body work is it really, and I don't remember my anatomy that well, but it did bring a really deep appreciation of the body. I just, I have known nothing about architecture, but clearly if how a building is built, like the foundation, all of that is going to determine how it stands up, whether it stands up. And literally how our body is placed or arranged has a lot to do. I call it the inner climate. It's the internal landscape and the internal climate, a lot to do with what we sense inside about ourselves. So there's certain things that we know. The spine, is one of the pathways of interoception in the body. That's literally it's not a place, it's a pathway where that interoceptive, that internal information, everything underneath the skin that arises, the 80% of the information that travels to the brain, only 20% comes in from the external world. So our spine has to have some openness to it, right? If it's really crunched. And I mean, I believe I don't know that anyone's ever told me this, but when we have, I just think of how much we're sitting this past year, and then how much society sits, at least in the United States, cars, computers. I remember 20 years ago when that drawing came out, I think it was a New Yorker magazine of human evolution going from animals up to the pre-human Neanderthal, right? Into Homo, Homo sapiens. I'm trying to, am I getting the terms correct? Yeah, Homo sapiens.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And then all of a sudden you see this human being who's coming back down to sitting. So it was sort of like, what are we doing with evolution? So I believe having an open, free spinal pathway is actually more empowering, because we can channel more of our internal information. In 88, I think it was, Stephen Porges and a team of researchers researched that sacral neutral promotes vagal tone. Vagal tone is a scientific measure of shifting towards social engagement. So sacral neutral is not, extended, it's not flexed. So when we sit with a posture where our sacrum can be neutral or pass through neutral, that inner climate is cueing, it's a little bit safer in here. It's just like the sun coming out from the clouds in terms of the climate, right? Or if maybe it's the sky clouding up and it's going to rain, and maybe that's a safer climate. So it's literally, I think sitting in ways where we can actually open up our chest and breathe, or just, pressing on the sternum. I mean, there's just so many practices where we can engage the physicality, the anatomy of our body, and talk to our physiology, make contact with our own physiology, and that'll shift the way we feel inside.
Through your lens, your practice, your clinical experience, like, where do you want to see the field go from here, both in practice and research?
Well, I think research would be, more research, and I think there's limitations in research. There's been an emphasis on evidence-based practice, clinical trials. Those are great, and they're limited. It's an extremely limited source of information. So I'd love to see more biological research, working with biomeasures. And I know there's another term for that, but, with dance movement therapy, looking at heart rate variability, looking at vagal tone, oxytocin, the production of oxytocin, things like that, I think would be really, really interesting. And as a field, I mean, I would like to see more scientific research in those biological ways. I'd love to see the field of science in general embrace that more. I'd love to see behavioral or mental health not focus on evidence-based, practice-based evidence, actually saying, you know what, let's gather in the clinicians, let's gather in the clients, what has been helping people, what's been working. Let's figure out how to research that. So what if it's not a random clinical trial, with a control group? Are there other ways to research things? Like, let the clinical practice, the dialogue that occurs, if every clinician was asking their clients what helped, maybe doing some grounded theory to just sort of figure out what are the things that we want to research, and then figure out ways to research it. I think that would be really helpful. And as for the field in general, it's like that. And it's also recognizing, I mean, dance movement therapy, we're talking to some extent about a field that is still, I know when I went to school, they talked about the 5 female pioneers who were, Americans or European descent, white women. I think also, and this is happening, I mean, the seeds are being planted and it's beginning to happen in our field, the recognition that dance movement therapy in this Eurocentric or American-centric way is one stream in an ocean of how dance has always been healing from, I don't even want to name for how long that's been going on. So ancient dance and sacred dance doesn't need to be called dance movement therapy. I think that's a bit colonialistic. And it's the recognition that the power of dance has always prevailed in so many cultural ways. And so that when we are working as dance movement therapies, we are also engaging with that field. We are also sourcing from that field. We're also bowing to that ancestry, to those elders. So the more spiritual, ancestral, historical aspects of dance, I think, just as a field, some research on that, and there is already, a fair amount of research and theory, but I'm going to call it research since I'm already hoping that we revolutionize research and it's not just quantitative. And I do think there's an opening to qualitative research, but for so many years it's been focused on quantitative, but also just recognizing that research includes storytelling and narratives that may not even be verbally spoken that are carried in the bodies. I mean, that's how so many ancient traditions and indigenous communities, there's transmission of knowledge in a way that is not measurable,
Mm-hmm.
but it's known. And that's
Yes,
the realm that we're
yes.
in this field. And so that, and the hardcore, let's do some EEGs or whatever it is, brain scans, whatever it is. Let's measure your theta waves. Let's measure your heart rate variability, all of that too. That's
Yeah, as someone that's really more inclined towards, as, as a researcher, I've gotten really passionate about a lot of that stuff. How do we measure these things, whether through the cortisol or different hormones or all of these various biomarkers that we can look
yep,
at to start to
yep,
quantify. And I've really had to circle around and come back to, while that's important, also what's important are these things that we can't necessarily measure, because working with mental health and the feelings of people, it matters, even the things that we can't quantify. Like,
yeah,
how do they feel? And that really is a testament to whether our work is effective or not, even
yep,
if it's not
yep.
always measurable.
Yeah,
Yeah, going back
biomarker.
to even the yes, yes. It's
That's
like
the
the
term, yeah.
quantum physics that you even spoke about. Yeah, the biomarkers. So that's something that I'm really curious about investigating in my own work. And
Right. I hope you do.
I really think some of these other fields, looking at some of those harder to quantify things, the quantum physics can really start to build those connections of why these qualitative things work. So that's also something that I'll be digging into. But
Yeah, I'm so excited. Are you going to go on? And I hope you're going to do a PhD, and of course that's one, that's sort of the standard academic. But I'm listening to you going, good. I hope you're going to do a lot of like be one of the people who helps this research happen in our field. However you do that.
I definitely don't plan to stop anytime soon.
Cool.
This feels like an introduction for me to even what we might need as a field. I believe so much in this work, and I think that being able to contribute to the research will help legitimize the field in the eyes of the larger medical community
Yeah. Yeah.
and larger society, so we can start getting things like more funding and more job creation, more spaces opening up for our work that I already believe in so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no,
So,
I hollered biomarkers because that was the term
yes.
they used to be called biomeasures. I'm old enough that sometimes my language is a bit dated, but yeah, biomeasures. Um,
Yes, I figured that might be the term that you were referring to.
yeah.
Yes, and so that's one that's come up in my work a lot, looking at whether it's cortisol or the endocrine system, all of that, and how even movement impacts those. You mentioned like the lymphatic system,
Yeah.
all of that. So
Yeah.
and that brings in that holistic piece again. Like, we're impacting the mental health, but also how is the mental health impacted by all of these systems in the body, and which is really cool. We're so connected, mind, body, and spirit.
Yeah.
So I think to end, I thank you so much for your time. First of all, it's been such a gift to get some of your wisdom again in a more formal form as an interview. I've loved taking classes from you as well. So, is there a simple breath practice or something you'd be willing to leave people with?
Well, I'll do the one that I just mentioned. I call it regulation breath. I mean, it
Yes.
has a bazillion names, but it's just placing our hand on our sternum and just tracking for any movement there. There are many reasons why any of us might not feel any movement in our sternum. And, it might be that we're pressing too hard or not hard enough. So maybe taking a moment to adjust our pressure. But I often, invite people, just notice if you feel movement in your sternum, and depending upon where that goes, it's like, okay, notice if you don't feel any movement, notice that you're breathing, and do you feel any movement in your sternum when you breathe? And so that's the first part, is just taking a moment to appreciate the movement that might be there. And again, if it's not there, it's okay. There's a reason. Our tissue might be really tight. Our breath might have gotten caught somewhere. The natural movement of the breath is on the inhale, the sternum will rise into our hand, and the exhale, it'll drop back down into the body. And so then what I invite people to do is on every exhale, just gently press your sternum, only 5 to 10% of your strength. And so whether this feels new or not, what we are actually doing is following the natural movement of the sternum as it rides our breath. So we're working anatomically, right? This is working with the sternum, working with an anatomical structure that literally moves in response to breath, or more poetically, rides the wave of the breath. I like to call the sternum the warrior shield for the heart. And so that's what we're doing. And this can be very regulating. And what I've noticed, and I'm, as we're doing this, invite anybody watching to keep doing it. I started doing it with kids who would get really worked up, anxious sometimes, hyper aroused sometimes kids just being kids when I was being a dance therapist with a group of kids. And we'd pause and either sit or lie down. Sometimes I'd have them lay down with their sternum to the ceiling and just do this. And they would calm down. So that was me. I was wanting them to calm down in the instances where they were just being wild. But I also noticed that it would help children regulate their breath and therefore their nervous system in helpful directions. So somebody who was maybe really withdrawn would come out a little more and be a little more engaged, maybe in that mobilization without fear state, or maybe which is, a pathway to engagement. Or somebody who was really worked up or seemed really anxious might calm down a little bit. So it can state shift in a direction that's helpful for our own self-regulation. So regulation breath, very simple. It can ground and center, which is one of the clusters of states. It can calm, relax, or energize, play, eyes, mobilize. So it can become a dance. A lot of times if you press and if you actually follow the movement through your spine, you can start to dance.
And that goes back to that universalizing idea of like everybody, we all need breath. That's part of the human survival. And so to be able to pull from these tools that are useful for every single person, I think really adds so much value.
Yeah.
I just appreciate so much the work that you do, the research you do, as well as your willingness to step into the role as a teacher and help train up the next generation of dance movement therapists. So thank you so much, Amber.
Brianna.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.